At exactly 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, emergency briefings reportedly began inside multiple intelligence and defense agencies after a series of overnight military strikes signaled what could be the most dramatic escalation in the Middle East in decades. Within less than 4 minutes, US and Israeli strike systems destroyed another wave of Iranian missile launch platforms as part of the rapidly expanding campaign known as Operation Epic Fury. Military commanders now claim the Iranian Navy has been effectively shattered, with 24 warships eliminated in just 3 days, while coordinated airstrikes continue targeting missile infrastructure, air defenses, and underground command facilities tied to the regime's strategic command network. But the explosions are not the part that has diplomats panicking. The real shock came from a message delivered late last night that may have rewritten the rules of this entire conflict. President Trump issued a statement declaring that there will be no negotiations with Iran, only unconditional surrender. For more than 40 years, every major confrontation involving Iran has eventually led to negotiations, sanctions, or temporary ceasefires. This time, the demand is different. This time, the demand is total capitulation. And if that demand is enforced, analysts warn it could trigger the collapse of one of the most entrenched power structures in the modern Middle East, potentially reshaping the region overnight. Before we break down what this means, make sure you subscribe right now, because mainstream networks are still hours behind what's actually unfolding. What you're about to hear next explains why governments across multiple continents are suddenly scrambling behind closed doors. So here is exactly what we're going to break down in this analysis, because the situation unfolding right now is far more strategic and far more dangerous than the headlines suggest. First, I'm going to walk you through the 3 critical demands now emerging behind the scenes that could determine the fate of Iran's leadership. These demands are not symbolic diplomatic gestures. They are structural conditions that would effectively dismantle Iran's missile infrastructure, weaken its military command network, and isolate the regime from the rest of the region. Second, I will explain the unexpected geopolitical chain reaction that has already begun. Instead of rallying support, Iran's retaliatory attacks have reportedly pushed multiple neighboring countries closer to the US-led military coalition. In fact, more than a dozen countries across the region are now being drawn directly into the strategic orbit of this conflict. And third, we're going to map out the 3 possible endgame scenarios that could unfold once the current military pressure reaches its breaking point. Because if the pace of Operation Epic Fury continues, the world may soon witness something that hasn't happened in decades: the forced restructuring of power across the entire Middle East. To understand why the situation has escalated so rapidly, we need to break down the strategic architecture behind Operation Epic Fury. What is happening right now is not simply a military campaign. According to defense analysts, it is a multi-layered pressure strategy designed to force a political collapse without launching a full-scale ground invasion. Let's break this down step by step. Condition 1. The systematic destruction of Iran's missile infrastructure. The first objective of the campaign is the elimination of Iran's ballistic missile launch capability. Military officials say one of the most significant developments is the speed at which launch systems are being destroyed. Strike coordination now reportedly allows coalition forces to identify and eliminate launch platforms within minutes after activation. This creates a strategic trap. Every missile fired exposes the launcher to immediate retaliation. Former U.S. Central Command advisor General Robert Abrams once warned about this exact type of battlefield dynamic. He explained in a defense forum several years ago that modern surveillance networks make missile forces extremely vulnerable once a conflict reaches full escalation. In other words, the more Iran fires, the faster its arsenal disappears. That dynamic alone could cripple Iran's ability to project power across the region. If you're starting to see how serious this is becoming, hit the like button right now, because what we're discussing is not just another exchange of airstrikes. This is a strategic dismantling of military capability in real time. Now let's move to the second layer. Condition 2, strategic isolation of the Iranian regime. Normally, in Middle Eastern conflicts, regional players attempt to stay neutral, but something unusual is happening. Instead of gaining support, Iran's retaliatory strikes have reportedly unexpectedly pushed neighboring countries closer to the US and Israel. Security analysts point out that attacks directed toward multiple regional actors have triggered a defensive alignment among governments that previously tried to avoid direct confrontation. According to former US Ambassador Ryan Crocker, regional security dynamics tend to shift rapidly when countries feel directly threatened. Once that threshold is crossed, alliances form very quickly. And that appears to be exactly what we are witnessing. Defense briefings now suggest that over a dozen countries may be indirectly participating in intelligence sharing, air defense coordination, or logistical support tied to the ongoing campaign. This creates what strategists call a coalition pressure ring. Instead of facing a single opponent, Iran could find itself confronting a coordinated network of states operating across multiple fronts. That kind of geopolitical isolation dramatically limits a country's strategic options. Now we move to the third condition, condition 3. Economic and military exhaustion wars are rarely decided only by explosions. They are decided by sustainability. Every missile interception, every strike mission, every aircraft sortie costs enormous amounts of money and logistical resources. While coalition forces have access to deep industrial production and allied support networks, Iran's defense infrastructure faces far greater limitations. Legendary investor Warren Buffett once described prolonged conflict in economic terms. Wars are often determined by which side can continue paying the bill longer. And that observation applies directly to the current situation. If Operation Epic Fury continues at its current tempo, Iran would face simultaneous pressure on 3 fronts: military degradation, diplomatic isolation, economic strain. Individually, each of these pressures is serious. Combined, they can become overwhelming, which brings us to the fourth and most sensitive factor: evidence. 4. The leadership decapitation strategy. Some analysts believe the ultimate goal of this campaign may not simply be destroying weapon systems. It may be targeting the command structure itself. Recent reports suggest that multiple high-ranking officials tied to Iran's military leadership have already been killed in precision strikes. Strategic facilities connected to leadership bunkers and command networks have also reportedly been targeted. Military historian Professor Elliot Cohen once explained that modern conflicts increasingly focus on decision-making nodes rather than battlefield formations. In simple terms, disabling leadership can paralyze an entire military structure. If command systems collapse, coordination disappears. And when coordination disappears, even large military forces can suddenly become ineffective. Now step back for a moment and look at the full picture. Missile systems under constant attack, regional alliances tightening, economic pressure building, leadership structures potentially being targeted. Taken together, these 4 conditions create an environment where the Iranian government faces a level of strategic pressure it has rarely experienced before. But here is the critical question. Pressure strategies only work if the targeted government eventually decides to compromise. And that leads us directly to the next phase of this analysis. Because when the deadline implied by an unconditional surrender ultimatum approaches, there are only a few ways this situation can unfold. And some of those possibilities could reshape the global balance of power overnight. Now we arrive at the most important question. What happens when this pressure reaches its limit? When a government is confronted with overwhelming military pressure and a political ultimatum, history shows that only a small number of outcomes are possible. Analysts studying the current situation generally outline 3 realistic scenarios that could unfold in the coming days or weeks. Let's walk through them carefully. Scenario 1: full capitulation. The first and most dramatic possibility is complete surrender. Under this scenario, Iran's leadership would agree to the demands implied by the current ultimatum. That could include dismantling large portions of its missile infrastructure, halting regional military operations, and accepting international oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future escalation. Such an outcome would represent a historic geopolitical shift. For more than 4 decades, Iran has maintained its position as one of the most influential power centers in the Middle East. A full capitulation would dramatically alter that balance, potentially opening the door to new leadership structures, diplomatic realignments, and economic reconstruction initiatives. Some analysts believe this outcome would immediately trigger a wave of negotiations involving regional governments, international financial institutions, and security organizations seeking to stabilize the region after the collapse of the existing power structure. But this scenario also requires something extremely rare in geopolitics, a leadership willing to surrender power under pressure, which brings us to the second possibility. Scenario 2, partial compliance. In this scenario, Iran attempts a strategic compromise. Instead of full surrender, the government might agree to certain conditions, perhaps scaling back missile development, allowing limited inspections, or reducing military activity in neighboring regions, while still attempting to preserve the core structure of the regime. This type of half-compliance has happened many times in international crises. Governments facing overwhelming pressure sometimes attempt to buy time, offering concessions that temporarily reduce tensions while maintaining enough leverage to negotiate future terms. However, partial compliance carries its own risks. If coalition leaders believe the concessions are insufficient, military operations could continue. That would place Iran in a difficult position, facing ongoing strikes while simultaneously trying to maintain internal stability and political legitimacy. And that leads us to the third and most dangerous scenario. Scenario 3, total breakdown. This is the outcome that security experts fear the most. If Iran refuses to accept the ultimatum and continues escalating military retaliation, the conflict could enter a full regional war phase. Under this scenario, multiple fronts could ignite simultaneously. Regional proxy forces might become fully active, global shipping routes could face disruption, and international energy markets would likely experience severe shocks. The geopolitical consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. Global powers might be forced to intervene more directly, alliances could rapidly reorganize, and economic systems tied to energy supply could face unprecedented instability. In other words, the current conflict could evolve into something much larger than a regional confrontation. And the critical factor determining which of these scenarios becomes reality may be time, because once an ultimatum is issued and military pressure continues to intensify, the window for compromise begins to close very quickly. Right now, the clock is ticking. Operation Epic Fury continues to intensify, missile systems are being dismantled, regional alliances are shifting, and a political ultimatum has already been placed on the table. Whether the world fully realizes it yet or not, the balance of power in the Middle East may already be entering a new phase. For more than 40 years, the geopolitical structure of the region has revolved around a fragile equilibrium, deterrence, proxy conflicts, and carefully managed escalations. But moments like this can break those systems. If the pressure continues and the ultimatum holds, we may soon witness something that rarely happens in international politics, the forced restructuring of a regional power center. And when that happens, the consequences rarely stay contained within one country. So now the question shifts to you. Do you think Iran's leadership will eventually step back and negotiate, or has this conflict already crossed the line where compromise is no longer possible? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every perspective because debates like this often reveal how people around the world interpret these turning points. And if you want to stay ahead of the next developments, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because the situation is evolving quickly and the next chapter of this story may unfold sooner than anyone expects.